Brother Eggman says, the day of the Lord will be a day God brings his plumb line, his standard of righteousness, and lays it on the world. Anything that does not align with his standard will be destroyed. This is in contrast to the Great Tribulation, in which people will be living in peace and safety without any concern for their future. Now, in case you're confused as to why it's called Great Tribulation, wrath of Satan, and yet at the same time, the world will be living in peace and safety, don't be confused. It requires a little bit of context reading, which I believe Brother Eggman's going to do later on, so don't object just yet. Continuing, the unrepentant people who thought they had nothing to worry about, who thought that they would never have to be accountable for their actions, they will respond to God's judgments with terror rather than with repentance. They will attempt to escape the judgments on their own human strength instead of falling to their knees, asking Jesus to forgive them of their sins. These people will be completely oblivious to the darkness in their souls and refuse to turn to God for help. This is in contrast to the time of the Great Tribulation, in which these same people will be enjoying the benefits of a society that persecutes and kills Christians and Jews. So there's a little bit of explanation as to why it's called the Great Tribulation, but at the same time they'll be crying peace and safety. It's because of who is the object of the persecution and Satan's wrath. It's not necessarily the world at large that will be in his vice grip of terror. Rather, it will be Jews and Christians who will be the object of his persecution. And that's why the Great Tribulation's name is context specific to the elect or to Jews and Christians. Let's keep reading. In short, Brother Eggman says that the day of the Lord is the wrath of God, including the trumpet judgments and the bowl judgments. The Great Tribulation is the wrath of Satan, which includes persecution against Christians and deception that leads multitudes astray away from God. So let me pause and read that statement again, because that's the meat of what we're talking about tonight. The day of the Lord is the wrath of God, and it includes the trumpet judgments and the bowl judgments. And by contrast, the Great Tribulation is the wrath of Satan, and it includes persecution against Christians and deception that leads multitudes astray away from God. So let's go back over to the chart again. And the Great Tribulation kicks off after the midpoint of the 70th week of Daniel, when Antichrist declares himself God, sets himself in the temple, right? Read 2 Thessalonians chapter 2. And he demands global worship of himself as God, and he also implements the mark of the beast system at that time. So obviously, people who don't take his mark and don't worship him as God are going to be objects of his persecution in general. You don't have to be Jewish or Christian to be underneath his persecution, but the Bible describes the Great Tribulation primarily as a time of hardship for Jews and Christians for reasons that we'll get into later on. So by comparison, God's wrath, which is on the other side of the rapture, is specifically reserved for unrepentant sinners, meaning you don't have to be Jewish to be an unrepentant sinner. You simply have to be someone who's rejected God, his Messiah, his Holy Spirit, and his word of truth. Those things could have saved you, but because you've rejected those, then you become the object of God's wrath, and the day of the Lord is marked out for you. So that's kind of where we're going with this discussion so far. It's important to see the distinctions between the two, because as I've mentioned in a number of teachings in the past, as I study pre-trib, mid-trib, post-trib, pre-wrath, there is a healthy amount of equivocation, otherwise known as ambiguity, on the phrases wrath and tribulation. And based on the ambiguity and the what I'm going to call the conflation of those phrases, in fact, I need the chart to demonstrate what I'm talking about. I'm going to pick on pre-trib. If you notice, they call themselves pre-tribulation rapture. Their rapture takes place prior to the 7-year tribulation. Even though, if we break down that 7-year tribulation, it's broken up into tribulation for the first 3.5 and great tribulation for the second 3.5. They nevertheless identify the entire 7 years as God's wrath. i.e. the tribulation, and thus the phrases, the nomenclature of tribulation and wrath are conflated. They're intermixed, they're combined, and thus they're not sharply distinguished against each other in general discussions, and this causes people to believe that when there's a passage that exempts the church from wrath, such as 1 Thessalonians 5:9, the famous "we're not appointed to wrath" passage, well, pre-tribbers read that word wrath there as tribulation. It's all 7 years of it, and thus they hold their claim that, well, since God told Paul that we're not going through wrath, and since wrath and tribulation are the same thing, well, then we must be pre-trib. And some of the other views make equivocal judgments determining when we're talking about the wrath and the tribulation as well. Notice mid-trib, according to this chart, also has great tribulation and God's wrath overlapping with one another as far as the last 3.5 years. And since they don't believe that we'll go through that, we're going to be raptured prior to the wrath, just like pre-tribbers teach, then we have, again, confusion on those two phrases. Post-trib, likewise, in this representation of the chart, they're not agreed on when they place the God's wrath. Some place it, overlay it with the entire 7 years. Other post-tribbers reduce God's wrath to a mere 24 hours, and yet others place it maybe at the midpoint and following, kind of like, let me just show you the chart in case you're getting lost. In this particular view, notice the post-trib at the very bottom of my chart. It doesn't extend for the entire 7 years for the wrath of God. It's reduced to the second half of the 70th week, and it occupies basically the second half of the 70th week. So that's different than this chart, right? This chart has God's wrath running the whole slice. But either way, this chart also conflates God's wrath with the Great Tribulation. I mean, this is identical to the pre-trib when it comes to calling the wrath of God and the tribulation the same thing. This chart takes the wrath of God and it calls it the tribulation, or it calls it the wrath of God for the second half, but it still conflates those two terms. And then this particular version of the chart for post-trib in the lower left corner reduces the day of the Lord to a mere 24 hours, to a literal 24-hour day. But it doesn't, according to this chart, seem to confuse the phrase tribulation with day of the Lord. So perhaps maybe this is a minority perspective. But going back to Brother Eggman, if we look at that statement, in short, the day of the Lord is the wrath of God. This is according to the pre-wrath model. The day of the Lord is the wrath of God, and it includes the trumpet judgments and the bowl judgments. Remember, there are basically three sets of judgments in the book of Revelation, beginning with Revelation chapter, say, 5, and working our way all the way through to about Revelation chapter 19 or so. And those three segments of bad stuff or judgments are in this order. You know what? I have a chart for this, so I don't need to kind of confuse you. Give me a moment. This chart does it. This is Brother Eggman's chart, so I may as well just endorse his chart. So let's just zoom in. Give me a moment. I want to do like this. So in the first part of the chart, we've got the seals. You can see kind of 4 of them. This isn't really good. It's too big. This part where I'm circling with my mouse, and in post-production, maybe I'll put a little orange square around it. The seal judgments occupy a good bulk of the 70th week of Daniel, seals 1 through 6. And then once this looks like this little red circle, kind of an ugly circle there on the chart. Seals run through 6, and then once we get to the 7th seal, the 7 trumpets, and this time I can't blow up because this will be easier. The 7 trumpets look like little ducks there, but they're not. They're actually shofars. 7 trumpets begin to be initiated in the book of Revelation, starting with chapter 8. Those are all come out of the 7th seal itself. And then once we get to the 7th trumpet or shofar, the 7 bowls or vials are, some people call them vials, I like to call them bowls. These are also initiated, and all 7 of those bowls are come out of the last 7th trumpet. So point I'm trying to make is that there are 7 seals, followed by 7 trumpets, followed by 7 bowls. And going back to Brother Eggman, the day of the Lord includes the trumpet judgments and the bowl judgments, but notice that it does not include the seal judgments in Revelation chapter 6. So this is also a distinguishing feature of the pre-wrath view that helps to locate the rapture in its timing as where it's found situated within those three particular sets of 7 judgments. The Great Tribulation, by comparison, is the wrath of Satan. You can read about that name, wrath of Satan, in Revelation chapter 12. And this includes persecution against Christians and deception that leads multitudes astray away from God. All right, let's keep reading, Brother Eggman. This is Eschatology, a Biblical Study of End Time Events. My name is Ariel Ben Lyman Han IV, and we're at about the 30-minute mark into our hour-long study, and we're looking at, by way of topics, we're on topic number 11, making a case for the pre-wrath view, which is a view. In fact, I think I'll just park it right there for a split second. And what we're doing is we're looking at a resource by Brother Aaron Eggman, which is explaining the difference between the Great Tribulation, which starts at the midpoint, and the Day of the Lord, which cuts short the Great Tribulation, but comes right after the Great Tribulation. And the event in the middle of those two things is the rapture itself. Let's go back to the other chart that I'm mostly parked out on. So I just want you to see the Great Tribulation more or less in the middle of your screen. In fact, I think I can blow this one up real quick. So we got the Great Tribulation there, which is the second 3.5 years. And then we've got the rapture. And then we've got the Day of the Lord, which is God's wrath, which follows after the rapture, which follows after the Great Tribulation. Okay, so that's what we're looking at right now. Let's keep reading Brother Eggman. Paul writes in a number of different passages that Christians are not appointed to go through God's wrath. It's not just one verse. I want to let you guys know. It's not just 1 Thessalonians 5:9. That is a chair passage. It's one of the chair passages, along with, say, Revelation 3:10 for the pre-tribbers. But the verse that Paul mentions in 1 Thessalonians is already built on copious amounts of passages from the Old Testament to describe the day of the Lord, as well, which is the wrath of God, as well as other teachings that Jesus himself talked about in his own when he was here on earth and was explaining things to his disciples. Paul is a student of Yeshua first and foremost. So he writes in a number of different passages, like in Romans as well as Corinthians and Thessalonians, that Christians are not appointed to go through God's wrath. Let me interject and just do yourself a favor. It will take some time to do this, but sometime do a study on the wrath of God. You can start out as a word study if you want, using concordance, but don't get stuck on the word wrath only. You have to also pull in judgment and condemnation, synonym words to wrath, and see what you find in the Bible. Who is wrath aimed at? Who is wrath reserved for? And then that'll give you a better idea of why the pre-wrath position says what it says about wrath. Okay, God's wrath is twofold. This is Brother Eggman's post. First, it refers to eternal separation from God, and second, it refers to the day of the Lord. Two very important aspects. There is a temporal aspect to God's wrath, right? It'll be poured out for earth dwellers at a time in history when they are still living, and they'll still be able to feel the pain of the punishment that God is inflicting on them. So that's one aspect of wrath. The other aspect is that there is an eternal judgmental aspect to wrath. That's why I said you need to expand your study. Don't commit a word study fallacy by collapsing everything you think about wrath into a single word such as wrath. To be sure, the English version wrath has about 2 or 3 different Hebrew and Greek counterparts. So, you need to look at all of the words involved, but there is what we could call the final judgmental aspect of the wrath of God, which is eternal separation from God. And of course, for Paul to tell Christians that we're not appointed to this kind of wrath just makes sense, because that's Theology 101. Every Christian needs to know that we're saved from the eternal punishment and wrath of God. But what Paul's trying to say in that Thessalonian passage, 1 Thessalonians 5:9, that we're not appointed to wrath, is that, and we'll let Brother Eggman refer it to here, is that there is a wrath to come. And typically, when Paul's referring to the eschatological wrath, meaning the day of the Lord that is punishment poured out on living human beings, then he will often use some type of phrase, a technical term like the coming wrath or the wrath to come, or the context will let us know that he's talking about something that's down the road that's going to be experienced by living people, rather than, say, the eternal separation that's reserved for people who've already died and are now standing at the great white throne judgment facing God, and they don't have their advocate, Yeshua. So, sorry for that interruption to the reading when I said I wasn't going to interrupt, but I am going to read through this tonight. Okay, we've got a lot of time. Aaron Eggman continues, when Paul uses the word wrath, he's not referring to Satan's wrath. He's referring to God's wrath. This is evident in Romans 5:9. Paul explicitly writes that Christians are saved from God's wrath. So let's read one of the verses. Romans 5:9, since we have now been justified by his blood, how much more shall we be saved from God's wrath through him? And again, this is true for both aspects of God's wrath. Because of our justification by his blood, we are saved from the eternal wrath of God, which is eternal separation from God in eternity. So I keep stressing the word eternal for a moment. You have to remember that according to that chart, this chart, God's wrath and the day of the Lord are also reserved for a certain time period of history, but they're not going to run into eternity. God's wrath is a specific time. How long that time is, we don't know. Could be 24 hours, but I doubt it. I highly doubt it that it's 24 hours. I believe it's more like months long, maybe even years long. Later on, I'll show you why I believe that it cannot be shorter than at least 5 months. But so the wrath of God is a specific time frame, just like the Great Tribulation is a specific time period. It has a beginning and it has an end, a termination. So that's what Brother Eggman is referring to. There is the wrath of God that is reserved for anyone who rejects Jesus as their Messiah, and that's waiting for them after they die. This is true. I don't think Paul needs to stress that point too heavily to any given readership, although it is part of his gospel message. But what Paul is trying to get them to understand is that if you locate the word wrath inside of the day of the Lord, like Paul did from using the Old Testament resources, then you're finding out that the day of the Lord, which again, this is copious. This is not a fringe concept. This shows up all over the Old Testament, all over the Tanakh, and it's very well developed in the mind of the Jewish person of the first century when Paul was writing these words, that the day of the Lord is a day of retribution against the wicked nations that have rejected Israel, punished Israel, persecuted Israel, exiled Israel, but that also at times the day of the Lord is leveled at Israel for her disobedience. Works both ways. Let's keep reading Brother Eggman. Christians will experience Satan's wrath, which is Satan's work through the man of lawlessness, during the final generation before Jesus returns. Jesus' coming initiates the day of the Lord. Unbelievers are taken unaware at Jesus' coming and are swept into destruction. After I read this, by the way, if we have time in tonight's study, then I'll go back and start filling in with my own commentary. But first, I just want to read this. He continues, Christians are not appointed to go through this wrath and will be caught up to Jesus in the clouds. Now we have our going into the Thessalonian letters, and we're going to start reading some of the more famous verbiage that is associated with wrath. In 1 Thessalonians 1:10, Paul teaches that Jesus will come back and rescue believers off the earth before the commencing of the time of his wrath. Let's read 1 Thessalonians 1:10, quote, Paul says, and wait for his Son from heaven, whom he raised from the dead, Jesus who rescues us from the coming wrath. Here we have that phrase wrath coupled with a verb, right? Present participle, the coming wrath. And it's also a definite article that shows up in front of the Greek phrase. So it's a definitive time period in Paul's mind when he says the coming wrath. And I think it's unmistakable when he uses the phrase like he does here, the coming wrath, that Paul is not merely referencing the judgmental version of God's wrath that awaits every sinner at the end of their time on earth. In other words, the white throne judgment where everyone's judged and is exiled away from God, away from the presence of God. You spend eternal damnation in hell, etc. In other words, there's wrath of God, which is equated with hell, But then there's wrath of God that is equated with punishment here on earth while you are still alive. And so that's a bad place to be when you got hell on earth and then hell in hell, right? I mean, it's horrible. Paul says for Christians, no, we're not appointed to either one of those. It's neither the eschatological wrath, which will be poured out on living people here on earth in the time period of the 70th week of Daniel, nor are Christians appointed to the wrath, which is the eternal separation from God, obviously. Eggman continues. Later in this same chapter in 1 Thessalonians 4:13 through 5:10, Paul goes on to explain the manner in which Jesus will rescue Christians. I want to mention, by the way, that when you're reading through Paul's 1 Thessalonian letters, it's very important to catch the context of the entire letter as a whole, as speaking to the same group of people about the same issue and Paul's instructions on that same issue. And this is helpful to realize that Paul is not introducing topics that are disconnected from one another. Rather, he's likely, and this is the context that drives this, I believe is the best way to understand, that Paul's Thessalonian letters are one big teaching on the coming of Jesus, the parousia, which has two events connected to it, one on the front end known as the rapture and one on the back end known as the second coming. But the day of the Lord, this parousia, is the primary event that is in Paul's mind as he's writing to that particular church there in Thessalonica. Let's keep reading.